Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session, Test Automation, a glimpse of the near future from the experts who shape it. We have a very special treat for you today. We've assembled an all-star team of industry thought leaders for an in-depth discussion about the tools, technologies, and best practices that will shape your dev test environment in 2019. Our panel of experts include Angie Jones, Dave Haeffner, Gil Tayar, and Joe Colantonio, who will also host and moderate the discussion. So without any further ado, Joe, the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adi, for inviting me. I guess I just want to start off by saying, why am I hosting this webinar? The first thing is, I've been following Apply Tools since 2014, blogging about them, got to meet the founders and worked with Adi, so really love the product they have there. But recently, what I've really been blown away about is the awesome experts that are actually getting to work for Apply Tools, like Manoj Kumar, who contributes to a lot of open source projects. We have Gil Tayar, who is an awesome hardcore developer, but he's one of the few that I know that actually really understands testing as well. Dave Haeffner, they hired him as well. Dave has Elemental Selenium, which is one of probably the biggest email Selenium pro course in the world. He also does a lot of training. And also Angie Jones, who, if you've been to any conference of any size about testing or automation, you've probably seen her speak. She also has a ton of patents to her name. So we really have some quality experts within the field, but they also work for Apply Tools. So I thought it'd be interesting to get them all together in one room to talk about some trends we see going on in the industry that you could take away right away to help you with your automation efforts in 2019. So I thought we'd just jump right into it and get to the experts. Before we get into it, the first topic I've been hearing most about in 2018 on my podcast is continuous testing. And continuous testing really is the ability to instantly know or assess the risk of a new release or change of your application before it impacts your customers. And a part of that is a shift left that a lot of companies have been taking. So I thought it'd be great to start off with, what is shift left? What is continuous testing? And I believe, Gil, why don't you start off? I think you have a good definition of what shift left is to kick off this conversation.
Sure. If we see the development process as a linear progression of stuff to do, if you want, which is develop, test, and then deploy, then shifting left means taking that test step and shifting it left into the development process. From my point of view, this thing, the big question is why do we do that? And I think you answered that well. Continuous testing. We live in a world, an agile world, where there is no release anymore. We're constantly releasing, constantly changing. The plans constantly change, and that time that we have to do tests, that integration time and testing time, it's slowly disappearing. We have to find another pattern, another alternative, another methodology to do those tests that are crucial to the quality of the application. And for me, that's shift left, moving the testing into the development process itself.
Awesome. And so, Angie, I think I read an article you wrote recently about shift left. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe your experience with shift left and how any tips you can give someone to help them with their transformation over here to this continuous testing type approach more and more companies are taking?
Sure. Firstly, hi, everybody. Yeah, shifting left, it transforms how we develop software. So for quite a while, most software shops operated under the waterfall methodology, where there were stages of software development, and the next stage didn't begin until the previous stage was completed. So for example, you had like requirements gathering, then design, then development, then testing. And with this approach, testing was usually the final stage before releasing the software. But with more modern approaches to software development, it's critical for testing to be done much earlier in the process, essentially shifting more towards the left of the development stage as opposed to only being on the far right of it. So it's important because it affords teams huge benefits, such as finding bugs much earlier, sometimes even before the code is ever written, if you really play this right. So this results in a higher quality of code and far less expensive way of achieving that. I must say though, I think that there's a misunderstanding that shifting left means that developers are now responsible for testing, like solely responsible. I believe that developers are indeed involved in quality initiatives, as are others, like the business analysts and the product owners. But if a team truly wants to shift left, it doesn't simply mean have someone automate all of your tests, for example. It means quality needs to be baked into all phases, and it takes everyone on the team to participate in that. And testers can help lead this initiative by bringing their wealth of domain knowledge, their expertise, their intuition into the planning stage, the design stage, development, and so on. And sure, automating the high value scenarios that the team wants feedback on so that these can run continuously. And for continuous testing, I also believe that it not only requires a shift left, but also a shift right. So we're seeing more and more people begin to discuss not just continuously running regression tests, but also testing and monitoring in production. So I think that's going to get a bigger focus in 2019. It's essentially testing to the right of releases. No matter how thorough of a job you've done, testing pre-release, is almost impossible to account for the interesting ways that customers will use your product once it's in their hands. So shifting right allows teams to do some testing in production where the real user data lies, and also monitor the trends and usages, which will also allow them to utilize that information in the analytics and stuff for their pre-production testing as well.
Awesome. So Angie, that's a few great points there. One, the role of testers isn't going away, and that developers still need the guidance of a tester. So I think the role of a tester is actually elevated as we go towards this continuous testing process. And the second part definitely is a shift right as well. I think with these AI tools we'll probably be talking about later, it probably will help us with that shift right. So Dave, just curious to know to get your input around what you think shift left is, or any tips you can give an organization that's trying to make this transformation towards continuous testing.
Sure. I've consulted with a handful of companies going through this transformation, and I think over the last few years, I've seen some interesting changes where companies clearly want to make this transition, and largely I've worked with companies that have legacy to deal with, and what's been missing in this transition is I think adequate tooling to move continuous testing into the hands of development, and I think that's we're going to touch on this, I think, in a little bit, but I think that it used to be one of two things would happen. You try to encourage developers to do more testing. So depending on the language stack, that might kind of instill people to automatically care. Like in JavaScript or in Ruby, those ecosystems tend to care more about testing just organically, at least from an end-to-end perspective, I think. But the tooling might not have been as mature as it is now. So you try to encourage developers to do more testing at the degree or the level that maybe the QA or testers might actually be thinking about. Short of that, you try to traditionally might take people who aren't developers by their trade and try to help them become more technical in that aspect of their job. And I think what we're seeing now is the tooling is becoming what it needs to be to enable with reliability and with efficacy people and teams to do this without necessarily having to become, take people who are testers and say, you also have to be a developer. Or, if they did want to become a developer, regardless of who it is and what skills they take on, I think the tooling is available and a bit more commoditized now.
Awesome. Definitely agree. Also, I think it's a mindset. If you have a really bad manual process, that's a waterfall. Even going towards continuous testing and automation is probably not going to be that good. So I think you definitely need a team also to embrace the whole testing type of continuous testing culture shift I think we're seeing. So along those things, Dave brought up tooling. So Dave, I guess why don't we just start off on what trends you probably have been seeing in tooling? There's a few I could think of on the top of my head, like more like developer-centric tools like Cypress or Jest, and just trying to get your pulse on the industry of where we see us now and where you think we'll be going in 2019 around automation tooling trends.
Man, I think that there's a lot here, and I think that everyone on this panel has some insight to contribute. What I do see is in the front end development ecosystem that the tooling is more mature. And I guess from my perspective and in my experience, I'll speak from that. I think largely teams that approach doing end-to-end automation specifically, they fall into the same set of problems. Every company thinks that their problem is potentially unique because their domain might be different or their app might be constructed slightly differently than other legacy behemoths. But largely every team I've consulted with has a core set of problems that are consistent across organizations. And the only thing that's different is to what degree of maturity the companies are at in terms of their implementation of their automation practice. And now that the tooling is becoming better, I think that companies are realizing that they don't have to solve all of the problems anymore, and that potentially they're solved even better than they could have imagined because a lot of the tooling is built into the browser. The developer tooling that's available from browser vendors is becoming so much more robust, and we see things with the W3C recommendation for WebDriver becoming what it is now, and we see tools like as you mentioned, things like Cypress or Puppeteer, and I think Gil can speak more to those tools, but I think that that's the trends that I'm seeing is that it's just becoming something that's turnkey and available and fast, reliable, fast and reliable. I think that those are the two keys. So you can get end-to-end testing without the expense of management, testing in the right place, basically.
Awesome, and I definitely see a trend, more and more teams getting more mature with their tooling, and I think that's been a big help. So Angie, I know you speak all over the world. Just curious to know what you've heard from anyone you may have seen at conferences on any sort of tooling trends you've seen or any best practices around automation tooling that can help someone in 2019.
Sure. It's really contextual. I agree with the views that Dave is seeing. I've been seeing the same thing with like front end developers and folks who are looking to do end-to-end automation. I'm keynoting Selenium conference next week in Chicago, and I talk about playing the automation game. So I'm going to give you like a little sneak peek of that right now. But software teams have a really bad habit of choosing their weapons without consideration of the players who need to use those weapons. So you have to first consider what players you have, and then you choose the best weapons or tools that the players will be most successful with. And I think that every tool has its place, really. Some of the tools are totally wrong for the player you're asking to use them. So if you want the developers to actively develop the automation code, then giving them something like a code list tool is all wrong. They're not going to use it, no matter how great the tool is. Likewise, if you want your testers who may have little to no programming background to be the ones mainly responsible for producing the automated tests, then tasking them with coding a software development project is a recipe for failure, right? Without giving them the proper training they need. So basically, it comes down to choosing the best tool for the players you have. Developers tend to like the more powerful tools like Cypress, Puppeteer, because of how close they can get to your application, your OS. But if you're not highly technical, all of that power can be intimidating, and you might need a simpler solution that works for your team.
Awesome, thank you, Angie. And so pre-webinar, we were speaking, and I know Gil had some interesting thoughts around Cypress and Puppeteer, the good, the bad, the ugly. So Gil, you are a hardcore developer. What are your thoughts around this type of tooling, and where do you see it going in 2019?
I think as a software developer and as somewhat a front-end developer, I think front-end is going through a huge renaissance in the past 3 years. If we're looking at front-end development 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, basically your code as a developer was untestable. You wanted to test, but you just couldn't, or almost couldn't. And today, Cypress, Puppeteer, JS DOM, and other ways enable you. Dave and I had a water cooler discussion like a few days ago about shift left, and part of what Dave said was shift left is also about testing where it makes sense. So if all I want to do is, for example, check that this field, that the email validation is working, I don't need to do a whole automation test, which is very, very expensive to run and very, very expensive to build, and which sometimes is somewhat flaky. I can just test the function that does email validation, give it the inputs, check whether it's returning, true or false. And that takes nanoseconds and is very, very cheap to write. And if we look at that's unit tests from a software developer. That's always been possible. But today, tooling also allows us to write full automation test that tests not the whole application, but one page or one component, do all the clicks and the inputs and the types and everything, even without running a browser. That's amazing. The tooling has progressed so far that we can do automation-like tests without even running a browser. Cypress and Puppeteer are on that spectrum of from unit tests that just test functions to integration tests that test sets of components. Cypress and Puppeteer test your whole application or just your front end, but they're still very, very lightweight. So, for example, if Selenium WebDriver is the Swiss knife of browser automation tools, of functional testing tools, all the browsers, all the languages. Cypress and Puppeteer try to be more focused on front-end development and saying, for functional tests, we'll just use Chrome. We won't support Firefox, IE, Edge, etc., etc. And we're not building a tool that is for all sense of purposes. We're just building tools for testing. They're very, very lightweight, very, very focused on their target, and front-end developer and very much oriented towards front-end developers. So if you want to write a Cypress or a Puppeteer test, you have to write it in JavaScript, but that's okay for front-end developers. So tooling, from my point of view, enable the front-end tooling that is today wasn't there 3 years ago. So that's the JavaScript renaissance and the front-end renaissance, and it enables to take part of those tests, those tests that occur again and again, test that this field is working, test that that field is working, shift all those somewhat boring tests to the developer where they make sense because they're very, very cheap, and leave the more interesting stuff, exploratory tests, very difficult end-to-end tests, to the testers. Now, a little bit about the role of testers here. Unfortunately, this is great for developers that know how to test. Many developers don't know how to test. I think it's also the role of the testers to nudge front-end developers and developers in general towards helping them test the code themselves.
Awesome. I believe I've read in a forum that Brian Mann actually says that he's the creator of Cypress, that it's really not an end-to-end test. So not only is the tooling, but it's using the tooling in the right stage of your pipeline. And there's not one for everything. So I definitely agree there. But we touched on shift left, continuous testing, and why it's important, and then looked at some tooling. And one of the last things I've been seeing more of this year is around accessibility testing. And as we shift left, have you been seeing any move towards more people being aware of making their software more accessible and how to test that in the shift left approach? That's a question from the audience, so just wanted to know if anyone had any thoughts around that particular topic.
Yep, and I think there's a great tool, and off the cuff I don't remember what its name is. A great tool that just I think it's based on Puppeteer, but I'm not sure. You just pass it a URL of a page, and it does all the sanity checks. It's like a linter for pages, for accessibility on pages. It does all the sanity checks to ensure that your page conforms to all the accessibility guidelines everywhere. High contrast, ARIA labels, etc., etc., etc. That's also an example of shift left, where the developer can just run that tool and test the whole accessibility thing by themselves. So yeah, and if there's any way we can send over the name of that tool, I will definitely find it and
Gil,
send it
is it
over.
the automated accessibility testing tool, AATT?
The one
I'll
from
have to look
PayPal,
into it.
right? That's the one from that I know of from PayPal.
Right.
Yeah, that's probably, it's a JavaScript thing.
I'm not sure.
We'll look into it and
Yeah,
we'll send it over.
definitely.
There probably may be more than one.
My blog, I have a whole list of them, but I'm sure Apply Tools has one as well. So
Great.
awesome. Thank you for that insight. And so we're getting some more questions. Let's just have one more question from the audience and then we'll move on here. Someone wants to know from Angie, would you consider Selenium a better choice for non-developer testers? I get this question all the time. What tool should I use? What tool is the best one? And I always say there is no best tool. It's whatever tool works for you or your company. Don't use the most popular one. Use what works for you. Any thoughts around maybe someone that's considering Selenium as a non-developer? Do you have any other options, or what's your go-to answer for that particular question?
Um, yeah, I mean, it depends on a lot of factors, right? So I look at if I'm consulting with a team, for example, I'll look at like who's going to be involved in it. Is it just that sole tester who's a non-developer, or are they going to get assistance from the developers? If you're going to get assistance from your developers, then it's better to align yourself with whatever they're going to be using. So you have to learn something new anyway. You might as well choose something that'll be common ground for you and the developers, and they'll be much more likely to pitch in if you're speaking their language. If the developers are not going to contribute, and we see that a lot as well, and it's just something that you as the non-developer tester want to do on your own and learn, it's going to be more challenging. So you want to go with a tool that has a lot of support. Selenium is right now like the go-to tool for automating UI tests, and there's tons of support. There's a huge community around it. There's lots and lots of courses and examples on it. So you'll do better if you have to do this on your own and using a tool like that.
Well, this is just a softball for Dave now. Now, Dave, I believe there's a new thing you may be working on that may address this question directly. So tell us a little bit more about Selenium IDE. I heard it was dead, but I heard rumors that it's just a rumor, that it's alive and someone dug it up and made it even better. So any thoughts around that? Don't hear you, Dave. I don't know if you're on mute or not.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, reports of Selenium IDE's demise, I think, were greatly exaggerated.
Right.
And so there was a point where it died, and I think that record and playback tooling has had a rough go of it. I think Selenium IDE existed starting back, I think, roughly around 2005, out of interest and necessity from the people that helped create it. But over time, it's kind of been limped along by people who have contributed, like any good open source project, with their free time. And I think that up until it was about a year ago, when the Firefox extensions changed, and that broke Selenium IDE in a fundamental way, and that's when the reports of it being dead were true. In the last year, Apple Tools has been contributing heavily to basically doing a reboot of the Selenium IDE, and that's what I work on full time now, is development for the Selenium IDE with my colleague Tomer. Corivo. It's just easier to go by usernames. And we were working on it full time and making it the tool that it really wants to be. I think that is tough. I think record and playback has had a stigma this whole time. I think that it's right for a lot of people. And then Angie touched on this earlier, but the idea that, you know, it's, if you have developers who want to do automation, then maybe the IDE is not for them. But it doesn't mean that it's a bad tool anymore. I think there was a time where you end up recording tests. They have brittle locators. It ends up falling into the common pitfalls of any automated practice, even if it's in code, where you can have poorly written tests that are hard to maintain. We've made great improvements in a lot of these things. We even have it where you can just record a test, not only just play it back in the IDE, but you can save it and then actually run it from a command line runner that effectively acts like an automation framework for you, where it handles concurrency. You can run your tests in parallel. You can have a base URL. You can have it pointed to different environments. You can do all these things. We even have a plugin system now so you can extend Selenium IDE to do many other things. So my thesis is that if you think badly of record and playback, I think you have an old story that's maybe stale and needs to be reassessed. So it's worth considering, especially now with the work that we're doing. And I think that we can solve all the problems just the same as everyone at a company does to build their own automation framework. So we're trying to do it in a way that is reasonably universal, that people can just use and work well for most any use case.
Awesome.
I'm going to jump in there. I've been doing automation long enough to remember when the codeless solutions were pretty much all that we had. And I've been burned by them before, so I definitely understand the industry's hesitation with giving this another go. But I think the important thing to understand is that some of the folks that are working on these codeless solutions, they were there too. They felt that pain as well. So we have Dave working on Selenium IDE. And Dave is the one who taught a lot of us how to be effective in writing code using WebDriver. So I have the utmost faith that Dave and his team are fully aware of the pain that we went through as an industry with those codeless tools back in the day. And they're bringing that knowledge in as they're contributing to this new generation of codeless tools that provide a lot of what was lacking before. And therefore, it's going to make this a viable alternative for the right type of tester. There's also other codeless solutions on the market that are employing AI to help mitigate past issues and even improve upon current issues that we have with coded solutions. So I'm not counting the codeless solutions out. I think that most of the respectable codeless vendors know that I'm keeping a very watchful eye on them because I've basically told them all of this. And I've had, demos of these products and interrogated them and tried their solution. I let them know when it sucks because frankly, we've come too far as a community to fall back into the same traps of yesteryear. So not on my watch. And you know what? All of them have been extremely appreciative of my scrutiny. And I believe we truly want to get this right this time. So definitely worth looking into.
Awesome. And I think as we move forward, what used to be a bad practice may be a good practice, that we should keep an open mind and always try things ourselves and see if it actually is going to improve what we're doing. And I think AI and machine learning are in the infancy, but I think in the future, I think it's definitely going to make this a reality. So keep an open mind with some of these things and give it a try. So the next topic, I don't know, I forgot why I actually have JavaScript here. I guess one of the things that comes to mind is a lot of questions I always get asked is, I'm learning automation, what language should I use? And I know maybe a few years ago, I spoke to Dave and he told me, I think the first or second most downloaded Selenium binding from Selenium HQ was JavaScript. And I think also Gil has some thoughts around JavaScript, how the good, the bad, the ugly around this as well. So Gil, just some thoughts around maybe JavaScript in 2019. Is it over? Is there a new language people should be jumping on? Any thoughts around it?
I'm a JavaScript groupie. I mean, I'm definitely not objective. I love the language. There's this quote I always say. It's called Atwood's Law. It's If it can be written in JavaScript, one day it will be written in JavaScript. So that's and it's true. I mean, think of all the email apps, that maps, whatever. Those are all front-end applications, huge front-end applications written in JavaScript. And JavaScript today, because it's the only language front-end developers use, has a huge ecosystem. It is basically the biggest ecosystem in all the languages out there. The NPM repository, which is just like the Maven repository or the PyPy repository in Python, is the largest repository in the world. It basically has everything you will ever need in terms of third-party library support, and it's basically all open source and very easy to use using NPM. Much easier to use than Java or C# or whatever. And in this case, I'm talking from experience because I've used all these languages. So yeah, I think JavaScript is on the move up. I think testers should explore that as an alternative to the main languages testers use, which is Java and I think C#. Not sure. And another reason to explore, at least, and I'm not saying using it, definitely don't throw away those years of Java, is the fact that front-end developers understand that language and are very comfortable with that language. So if you want to explore working together with those developers on automation, it's a good choice.
Awesome. Now, Angie, I for some reason I think of you as a Java expert. I think you taught courses at the collegiate level on Java. So, any thoughts around JavaScript or technologies folks should be learning in 2019, like JavaScript?
Yeah, you're right. I am a Java baby, so just the way Gil feels about JavaScript is how I feel about Java. But yeah, definitely seeing as in the shift left movement, definitely seeing JavaScript becoming more prevalent in the test automation tools because the front end developers are using that. But front end development is one piece. There's so many other types. There's back end, there's mobile, and all of this. And so I've worked at places where knowing one language was sufficient, but when I moved to the Valley, it was a lot more intense. So I worked at Twitter, and as automation engineers, we had to code in multiple languages pretty much every day. So Twitter's apps were built by different teams. So we had the front end folks, and mostly we used Selenium WebDriver for that, and using Java. But I did see where people were starting to look towards wanting to do JavaScript so that dev could pitch in more. And then for the mobile, there's the iOS developers, there's the Android developers. So these two teams specialize in different languages. And we couldn't build like a JavaScript framework and say, hey, iOS and Android devs, why aren't you pitching in, right? So these apps worked a bit differently. So we have the iOS automation frameworks written in Swift. We have Android frameworks written in Java. We had backend frameworks written in Python, some written in Scala. So on any given day, we need to contribute to any of these frameworks. So I would literally write code in Swift in the morning, need to switch to Java after lunch, and might dabble in like Python before calling it a day. So what I really learned in that role is that the language is not as important as the concepts themselves. So programming concepts are pretty much universal, have a very solid foundation in that, as well as a great understanding of test automation architecture. So learning new languages and switching between them wasn't as difficult in that case.
Awesome. Great stuff as always, Angie. And Dave, I think you might have an interesting perspective on this. I believe you got hired by Apply Tools, you moved to Israel, and I believe you are working on IDE. So what language are you using to actually create IDE, or what have you learned about anything from a hardcore developer kind of building a application perspective you think folks could learn from?
That's a great question. There's two pieces to it. So to answer the point about some statements I might have made in prior interviews with you about JavaScript and its popularity within the Selenium ecosystem, specifically the client bindings, it was at the time when I last tracked download numbers, it was I think number 2 out of the 5 officially supported programming languages for the bindings, Java being the highest. And JavaScript was the fastest growing by far. And based on my experience as a consultant, it tracks that the companies that have mature implementations in another language for Selenium were seeing a strong interest from all of their front-end developers to do testing with Selenium and JavaScript. This was before tools like Puppeteer and Cypress became more prevalent. And I think that largely was playing out in every company that I consulted with, and even other colleagues who come to me and say, oh, I have this problem, I have this mature implementation, years of Selenium tests written in Java, and now I have all of these front-end developers who want to basically recreate the entire framework and test suites in another language. So how do we manage that? And I'm sure that I'm assuming you've seen something similar play out in your organization, Joe, and potentially everyone else on the panel might have similar experience. But that was I think what led to the numbers. As far as within the IDE and my experience as a full-time software developer, Selenium IDE is built in JavaScript. It's a web extension built using a combination of React and supportive React libraries like Mobix and some Node. Some little bit of well, I guess it's not true a Node execution engine, but ultimately it's JavaScript. And I think that there's a lot of interesting things happening in the JavaScript language. I'm not as big of a fanboy as Gil, but I think that there's a lot of interesting pieces to the language. I also think there's some terrible things. So to kind of echo something that the creator of Selenium, Jason Huggins, once told me, he said, you can't recommend something unless you can say something bad about it. Unless maybe it was 3 things that were bad about it. I have at least 3 things that I think are bad about JavaScript, but not as many as I think are bad about Python. But I think that lessons learned from doing the development for the IDE and as far as language decision goes, I think that JavaScript definitely follows Atwood's law. I think that it's definitely not going anywhere. And I do think that based on my experience with how the interest from front-end developers has led to such a spike in usage for Selenium in the JavaScript bindings, and my experience with building the IDE and working more with front-end developers and looking at more how people build apps in the world so that I can understand how to effectively record what interactions are happening from a user perspective and play them back reliably. I think that it's definitely the direction things are going. The world's just going to become one big hot mess of JavaScript. Well, we're already there, but I think that it's like the other languages will start to fade away. That or it'll just be Haskell will be the answer.
Very cool. So I guess the key takeaway from this portion of the webinar is, if you don't know already, learn some JavaScript. 2019, I think, could really help you. Even be able to speak the same language as your developers is going to give you a lot of cred and going to help your efforts going forward. So along those lines, things to do in 2019, any common automation pitfalls you've been experiencing you want to see die in 2019? You'd love to see like a fresh start with this that people avoid going forward. Gil, we haven't heard from you in a little bit. Any automation pitfalls you'd like to die 2018 and not reoccur going forward?
I think I'll reiterate what I said earlier. Test where it makes sense. Don't try and test everything using end-to-end tests on like a staging environment, big tests that take a long time to run. Try and move those things towards the developers. Definitely the boring stuff.
Absolutely. And Dave, any thoughts? You've been around, you've done training, you've done consulting. Any automation pitfalls you've seen that you like to see eradicated in 2019?
Well, I think that there's it depends on the well, I think yes, and I think that it's not as simple as just saying we should eradicate them. I think it depends where people are in their automation practice, and to Angie's point, like which weapons need to be armed to the right players, and a lot of companies that haven't adopted already the simple solutions that already exist. And that's the big thing for me about the IDE is just I've seen the pitfalls, and that's why I just say, like, let's put all the good practices into the tool, and ideally we'll give this tool to the people that need it, and we'll make it better over time. And I think that, the principles that are going into the tool are the principles that I think people put into any of their automation practices. And so as long as people are just getting started, if they're on the path already, just continuing to improve. And if they haven't already gotten started, they should get started. And I think that given that there's such a strong community both in the front end developer space as well as just in the Selenium space, I think that there's a lot of friends out there, and there's a lot of knowledge, potentially too much knowledge. I think the best thing is get started, solve your problems, the ones you have, and ask for help. I think people are eager to help.
And don't use sleep to fix it.
Yeah, no doubt. Jeez. So Angie, I know you're very vocal. You mentioned with vendors that are showing you some of these record and playback tools or the scriptless technology. Is there any pitfalls you see when a vendor is demonstrating something to you? You think, oh gosh, I can't believe we're still doing this. Hopefully that's not going to happen going forward.
Yes. But I share that information with them and give them like the history and the reasons why and things like that. But there's also a lot of powerful stuff that are coming in these tools. Even Selenium IDE, I looked at that. And just to pick on Dave, he told me something works on his machine the other day, and I like cracked up laughing. So
It's a real developer now.
yes.
For what it's worth, I felt really bad about it.
But yeah, the tools are getting pretty powerful. But the power is useless if you don't know how to use it. So some of the cool things that are being added to these tools, I think that we need some education around them. So for example, like the logic commands that essentially equate to things like control structures, like loops and conditional statements. So even if a tester doesn't learn a programming language per se, I do think it would be valuable to provide education around these logic concepts so that they can make full use of these tools in the way that they want to do them.
Awesome. So we're up at 2:45. So what I like to do when I end a test talk is ask everyone for one piece of actionable advice they can give someone to improve their automation efforts. So let's keep this really at a high level and go around, and then we'll actually get to the attendees' questions. So let's start with this time. Angie, any actionable automation awesomeness you could think of someone could put in place to help them with their automation efforts in 2019?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of hunger in the automation space for technical content. I think most of the thought leaders that I speak with say that their most popular pieces on their website are the ones that are showing how to use some technique or some tool. And I think that's great. However, you can be a master at any of these tools and still fail at automation. And it's because there's a huge gap in the knowledge around test automation planning and strategy. So I'm seeing a lot more content from thought leaders around this, and I believe that's truly needed. So if you had to make just one resolution for 2019, I suggest learning as much as you can about the thought process around building a successful automation strategy and revisiting your existing projects to see what can you tweak or what needs to be adjusted based on what you learned there.
Great advice. How about you, Dave?
There's a topic that I think hasn't been totally top of mind. I've seen it come up a couple of times, and I think that it's going to start to become a big push in 2019, and it's actionable. Is it's not just in line with the strategy, but I think it has to do with analytics. It's what you spoke about, Angie, about the shift right and testing at the right of releasing, and I think that it's assessing efficacy of how are your users using your app, and what browsers and devices and resolutions are they testing in, and knowing whether or not you're actually testing in the valuable ways that are basically verifying the value that people get from the app, and ensuring you're not introducing regressions and making sure that it actually is a flawless experience for your users.
Awesome. And Gil, let's leave the last automation tip from you. Any thoughts?
Sure. I'm not a strategy person. I'm more technical. So one, use page objects and don't, write the selectors in your code. And two, never, ever, ever add sleeps to fix your flaky tests.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, so we're in the question portion. So if you haven't asked your question already, let us know. If we don't get to it, we'll try to answer it later after the webinar. And as we answer the question, here are some other resources you can check out to help you with your automation efforts in 2019. I'll keep this on the screen so you can take a screenshot, or we'll send this out to you in an email after the webinar as well. So one of the first questions we have, and I'm surprised no one's talked about this because I've been seeing more and more of this, even though I've been talking about it since 2014, and that is API testing. And the question is, it's more of a statement. What about the fact that API automation can replace front-end automation, considering that API automation is easier, cheaper, and more reliable? I think like anything, you could go overboard on stuff, but anyone have any thoughts around API testing and how they see it going forward in 2019?
Yeah, I'll go on. So I did this similar webinar with Applitools last year on 2018, and so I harped on API last year. So hopefully folks have made some traction with that by now. But yeah, it's definitely a highly sought after skill. More and more companies are looking for people who can do API testing, and there's really not a lot of testers who are skilled at that. So it's definitely something to ramp up on. And also, yeah, so you're doing your automation. I wouldn't say that API testing replaces UI testing, but it could definitely complement it. So everything that we do doesn't need to be tested on the UI. There are some flows that you can verify at the API level, and that's a lot less flaky and a lot faster to execute. However, be careful with the replacement word. So you definitely want to verify some things on the UI, like the look and feel, and basically like the functionality that's specific to the UI. But you're right. Don't go overboard on it. You can definitely move some of your testing to the API.
Awesome. Before we move on to the next question, anyone in the panel have any other thoughts around API testing?
It goes back to test where it makes sense. So
Yep.
Lots of tests make sense on the API level, much less flaky, much easier to write. And a lot of tests make sense on the UI level. So choose whatever makes sense.
Awesome. So the next question, this question is usually asked in conjunction with AI or machine learning, and it is, do you think the need to have a manual tester in a project will decrease in 2019? This is probably a loaded question, but Dave, since you're actually working on a team now developing, do you have a manual tester, or where do you see the role of a manual tester per se being in 2019 and beyond?
I think that the role is not going to go away. I think it's going to change.
I hope it won't.
Well, I think, well, if you look at it from unpacking AI and machine learning and into the different techniques, there's difference between supervised and unsupervised, and then you reach quickly the edge of my knowledge about these topics. But I think that right now, we certainly need to know how to not just blindly trust what our technology is telling us. We need to understand as much as we can that we're getting correct results. And I think that so far you still need human involvement. And I think that to help create the machine overlords that will replace us one day. I think humans have to fill that role until that happens, but I think it's a long way until that happens. I think that a lot of value can actually be gotten without AI and machine learning if there's just some critical thinking put into what the problem is, and with a mild amount of scripting you could actually solve problems pretty robustly. I gave a talk last year at SauceCon about flaky tests, and I kind of gave a negative view of AI testing techniques, because I'm a bit opinionated that I don't think we've solved the problems with the tools that we have already, and instead we want to try to create an even smarter solution to solve the problems when we haven't even solved them with the simple tools that we have, because I think we can get 80% of the value with 20% of the work. And so I think that the tooling is going to be interesting, and I think it's going to solve problems potentially in a different way than we realize too. But I think that we could take a step back too and think critically about the problems we're solving and try to actually solve them, and not just put blind faith in what these tools might offer before they're fully mature.
Awesome. Now, as we were talking about shifting left, Angie also brought up shifting right to do monitoring and production. And I've seen a lot of merging of skills into a person, such as an automation engineer, isn't necessarily just doing functional automation. They get pulled into a lot of what used to be called DevOps, or so I see a lot of roles merging into one. So the question is that automation tester role moving towards a DevOps enterprise? I would say that I think a lot of the functions are merging, but I'm curious to get the panel's thoughts around what is the role of an automation engineer in 2019, and how closely tied to DevOps is that role going to be, or should be?
Let me try and answer that. I think the word DevOps is as flexible as agile. It can mean lots and lots and lots of things. But in terms of shift right, I'm a huge fan because I believe a lot of the really, really important and interesting bugs can be found only in production. And testing in production is crucial to the quality of the application, because you can find bugs that really bug the users. No pun intended. Is this a DevOps or not? That's, I'm not a strategy person.
I think we look at the role of an automation engineer, and I think it does change a bit in the era of DevOps. So back in the day, a lot of us used to kind of code in a silo. We would get past some test cases and we crank those out. No one knew what we were automating. We run it on our machine and we give them a report tomorrow or so and say thumbs up or thumbs down, right? And so now we're seeing a transition where we are becoming part of this DevOps solution and culture, where we're integrating our tests into the continuous integration and deployment pipelines. And so there's a lot more eyes on the test. There's a lot of folks that are depending on these tests being reliable in order for us to release features. So it's no longer just running it on my machine. I see that a bunch of them fail. I rerun them, or I run them manually, and then I can give a thumbs up. No one knew that we were doing that behind the curtains, right? And so now everyone sees it as a lot more visible. And so there's a demand now for us to be better at our jobs. Like, these tests have to be very reliable, very robust, be able to run against different machines, because we're moving a whole lot faster. And so people want to be able to just check in code, have these tests run within a couple of seconds or minutes, and let them know if this can go out or not, or even gate it, right? It releases automatically in these continuous deployment pipelines. So yeah, we definitely need to strengthen our skills and find ways to get around like things like flaky tests and slow tests and things like that.
Well, I just want to thank the panel and thank Applitools for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all. Just so you know, I don't work for Applitools and I don't get paid for it. I really just wanted to get the insight of the people that are now working in Applitools around trends with 2019. And I really think that if you follow some of the advice and you keep learning, going forward, I think everything will be great. We have a lot of questions coming in that we can't get to because we're almost up on the hour. So we'll try to get to them after the webinar. And I just want to thank everyone for participating, and thank you once again to the panel and for Applitools for giving this awesome resource to the community.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.